Have you ever noticed how fear seems to sneak into every corner of your life? It waits in the quiet moments, in the small decisions, even in the very way you breathe. Fear of loss, fear of failure, fear of rejection, fear of the unknown. It's as if life itself has become a series of invisible chains, keeping you tethered to worry, anxiety, and doubt. But what if I told you that all of this fear, as real as it feels, is rooted in an illusion, a shadow that disappears the moment you shine the light of understanding upon it? In the heart of Buddhist philosophy lies a radical, transformative insight, the understanding of no self, or anatta. At first, it might sound abstract, even unsettling. How can there be no I, no fixed self to protect, no personal fortress to defend? Yet this very realization holds the key to a life without fear, a life of profound freedom and clarity. Imagine a life where you no longer tremble at the thought of loss. Imagine meeting challenges not with panic or resistance, but with a quiet, unwavering presence. Imagine stepping into each moment fully, unburdened by the weight of a self that always wants more, always clings, always worries. Fear, you see, thrives on attachment. It feeds on the belief that there is a fixed self, a me, that must be preserved at all costs. It whispers, protect yourself, hold on tight, do not let go. And so we clutch our identities, our achievements, our relationships, our very sense of who we are. And in doing so, we create the fertile ground where fear grows. The journey we are about to take together is one of profound discovery. We will explore the depths of the mind, uncover the roots of fear, and learn how the wisdom of no self can transform our lives. This is not just a philosophical idea. It is a practical, living path that can dissolve anxiety, open the heart, and bring a sense of courage and peace that is rare in today's world. Along the way, we'll encounter stories of people who have walked this path, ordinary lives touched by extraordinary insight, moments of heartbreak and triumph, doubt and clarity. And through it all, we'll witness the same truth. Fear loses its grip when we see the world and ourselves as they truly are, impermanent, interconnected, and not confined to a single, rigid identity. So, if you've ever felt trapped by your own worries, if you've ever wondered whether there's a way to move through life without trembling at every shadow, you're in the right place. The journey beyond fear begins with a single, radical idea: that the self you think you must defend is, in fact, an illusion. Take a deep breath, let it out slowly, and step gently but boldly into this exploration. Because the story we're about to unfold is not about eliminating life's challenges. It's about discovering the freedom that comes when you no longer fear them. And in understanding this, we prepare ourselves to look deeper, to see what lies beneath the surface of fear itself, to understand why it arises and how it can dissolve. That exploration begins with the very foundation of Buddhist wisdom, the understanding of no self, the doorway to courage, compassion, and freedom. When we first hear the phrase no self, it can feel unsettling. No self, then who am I? You might ask. If there is no me, what protects me? What makes my life real? These questions are natural. Our entire experience of the world is filtered through the lens of identity, through the stories we tell ourselves about who we are. Yet Buddhism invites us to take a bold step beyond those stories. At its heart, the teaching of anatta, or no self, points to a simple yet profound truth. The self we cling to is not a fixed entity. It is not a permanent, unchanging core at the center of our being. What we call I is a collection of ever-changing thoughts, sensations, emotions, and perceptions. It is a constantly shifting process, not a solid object. Imagine a river. Water flows continuously, never stopping, never the same from one moment to the next. You might call it the river, yet the water itself is always changing. Similarly, your body, your mind, your identity, they are streams of experiences ever in motion. There is no permanent you sitting behind the scenes orchestrating it all. There is only the dance of life itself. This insight is not meant to diminish your existence. On the contrary, it is profoundly liberating. When you see that the self is not a fixed fortress to protect, fear begins to lose its grip. There is no permanent me to be destroyed, no immutable identity to be threatened. The illusions that fuel anxiety, I must succeed, I must be accepted, I cannot fail, start to dissolve. Consider the mind of a child. Children experience life vividly, fully immersed in each moment without the heavy burden of self-consciousness. They do not yet cling to a rigid identity. They are free to explore, to fall, to rise, to simply be. The teaching of no self is an invitation to reclaim that freedom, not by becoming childish, but by seeing reality as it truly is, fluid, interconnected, and impermanent. Buddhist practice offers concrete ways to experience this truth. Meditation, mindfulness, and self-inquiry allow us to observe the thoughts and feelings that arise, to see them as events in consciousness rather than permanent fixtures of a self. With patience and attention, the boundaries of the self begin to soften. You start to notice that anger, sadness, or fear are not you. They are experiences passing through you, like clouds drifting across the sky. This realization transforms life at a deep level. You begin to act with greater clarity and compassion, because your choices are no longer dominated by egoic fear or clinging. You can face uncertainty with equanimity, meet challenges with calm, and open your heart more fully to others. The rigid, defensive identity that once imprisoned you begins to melt away, revealing a life that is lighter, freer, and profoundly alive. And here lies the paradox. In letting go of the self, you find true presence. In surrendering the illusion of control, you discover genuine power, the power to respond to life as it is, not as your fears demand it to be. This is the essence of Buddhist insight, that freedom is not obtained by constructing a self, but by understanding its impermanence and fluidity. So, as we continue this journey, let us keep this teaching in mind. The self is not a fortress. It is a flowing stream. Fear arises when we cling to a false solidity, and courage arises when we see the truth beneath it. The path to freedom begins with awareness, observation, and gentle acceptance of life as it unfolds. With this foundation, we are ready to explore the next crucial step, understanding how fear itself emerges, how it intertwines with attachment, and how the realization of no self begins to dissolve it. This is where the journey deepens, into the heart of fear and the mind's hidden patterns. Fear is one of the most powerful forces in human life. It shapes our decisions, clouds our judgment, and often drives our suffering. Yet its roots are not as external as we tend to believe. Fear is not born from the world around us. It emerges from our mind, from the stories we tell ourselves about who we are and what must or must not happen. At the core of this suffering lies attachment. Attachment is the belief that life can be made permanent, stable, and predictable. We cling to our desires, our identities, and our expectations, hoping they will protect us from loss, pain, or uncertainty. But the reality of existence is impermanence. Everything changes. Every relationship, every possession, every thought is subject to transformation. And when we resist this truth, fear arises. Think about it. When we lose something we hold dear, or when life unfolds in unexpected ways, the panic and anxiety we feel are not caused solely by the event itself. They are magnified by the mind's refusal to let go. We suffer not because life is harsh, but because our attachments are fragile and our sense of self is rigid. Buddhism teaches that suffering is rooted in illusion, specifically the illusion of a separate, enduring self. When we believe in a fixed I, we naturally develop a sense of threat. The mind constantly asks, will I be safe? Will I succeed? Will I be loved? Fear is the shadow of this illusion, ever lurking behind desire and expectation. Yet fear is not simply an enemy to be fought. It is a messenger pointing us toward areas of life where our attachments are strongest. Anger, jealousy, anxiety. These are all signals that the mind is clinging to something as if it were permanent. They reveal the hidden chains that bind us to suffering. By observing fear, by understanding where it comes from, we can begin to loosen these chains. Here, the teaching of no self enters once again. When we truly see that there is no permanent I to be destroyed, fear begins to lose its grip. The threats that once seemed overwhelming, the loss of status, the rejection, the uncertainty of the future, are seen in a new light. They are waves on the ocean of experience, not stones upon the fortress of an unchanging self. Practices such as mindful observation, meditation, and inquiry into the nature of fear allow us to encounter it without being consumed by it. We learn to notice the arising of fear in the body, the quickened heartbeat, the tightening chest, the racing thoughts, and instead of resisting or suppressing these signals, we gently allow them to be. Through this awareness, we discover that fear is not permanent and neither are we. Both are processes, flowing and changing. This is the liberation that comes from insight. The mind learns to meet fear not with panic, but with clarity and presence. Suffering softens because the source of suffering, the clinging to a rigid, illusory self, is revealed. We realize that life's uncertainties are not enemies. They are teachers guiding us toward deeper understanding. By tracing fear to its roots, we begin to see that our suffering is not inevitable. It is conditioned, dependent on beliefs, attachments, and illusions. And when these conditions are observed and understood, the mind opens to a freedom beyond the grasp of fear, a freedom that is the natural birthright of every being. Imagine a bird soaring effortlessly across the sky. It is free not because it controls the wind, but because it moves with it. Its freedom arises from the absence of unnecessary resistance. In the same way, the mind discovers liberation when it sees clearly that the self it clings to is not fixed, not permanent, not separate. This is the essence of the no-self teaching. By recognizing that the self is a collection of thoughts, sensations, and experiences, ever-changing and interdependent, we release the heavy weight of fear, anger, and suffering. The fortress of ego, built on the illusion of permanence, begins to dissolve. When the mind clings to a fixed identity, every challenge feels personal, every loss a catastrophe. But when the self is understood as fluid, fear loses its sharp edge. Life is no longer a battle to defend a fragile I. Instead, it becomes a dance with impermanence, a participation in the unfolding of existence. Consider how fear manifests in everyday life. The fear of failure, rejection, or illness often dominates our thoughts. We panic because we feel these events threaten who we are. But when the self is seen as a process rather than a thing, the threat disappears. Fear is recognized as a ripple on the surface of consciousness, not an attack on a permanent entity. Liberation through no-self is not merely intellectual, it is deeply experiential. Meditation allows us to observe the mind in motion, the rise and fall of thoughts, the ebb and flow of emotions, the passing sensations in the body. Slowly, a profound truth emerges. I am not this thought, I am not this feeling, I am not this body. I am the awareness in which all of this arises and passes. This awareness is spacious, luminous, and unbound. It does not resist life. It does not cling to permanence. It allows fear to arise and dissolve naturally, without judgment or suppression. In this state, we encounter a freedom that the ego could never provide, a freedom that is unshakable, unconditional, and always present. The liberation of seeing no-self also transforms how we relate to others. Without a rigid sense of me and mine, compassion flows naturally. There is no fear of loss, no need to defend an identity. Relationships become less about possession and more about connection, less about attachment and more about empathy. Yet this liberation does not mean detachment from life. On the contrary, it allows us to experience life more fully. Joy is more vibrant, sorrow more bearable, and every moment becomes precious precisely because we see its impermanent nature. The mind, once shackled by fear, now moves with the flow of existence, open, alert, and alive. In essence, seeing no-self is not a withdrawal from life. It is an invitation to live with courage and clarity. Fear no longer dictates our choices. Attachment no longer blinds our vision. Every experience becomes an opportunity for insight, every challenge a teacher guiding us toward freedom. With the mind freed from the illusion of self, we are ready to explore how to embody this freedom in daily life, transforming insight into action. The journey continues as we learn to live courageously, fully present, and unafraid. Imagine walking along a forest path. The sun filters through the leaves, birds call in the distance, and the air carries the scent of earth and moss. Each step is vivid, each breath alive. You are not lost in thought, not weighed down by regret or worry. You are here fully present. This is mindfulness, the art of anchoring yourself in the present moment. It is not a technique to escape life, but a practice to meet life fully without clinging or aversion. Mindfulness, when paired with the insight of no self, becomes a powerful tool against fear. Fear thrives in distraction. It feeds on imagined futures, on stories we tell ourselves about what might happen. But when the mind is grounded in the now, fear loses its grip. Awareness illuminates the impermanent nature of thoughts and emotions. Anxiety becomes a passing cloud, not a storm that consumes you. Consider the simplest acts: washing your hands, drinking tea, listening to a friend. Each is an opportunity to practice mindful awareness. Observe the warmth of the water, the aroma of the tea, the rhythm of your friend's voice. Notice how thoughts arise and dissolve without clinging. In this practice, the mind learns to rest in clarity and calm. Awareness also transforms how we respond to challenges. When a stressful situation arises, we tend to react automatically, guided by old patterns of fear and attachment. But with mindfulness, there is a pause, a space between stimulus and response. In that space, freedom emerges. We can choose to act with wisdom rather than reaction, with compassion rather than fear. Daily mindfulness is like tending a garden. Each moment of awareness is a seed. Some seeds blossom immediately, others take time to root. But gradually, the garden of the mind becomes lush with clarity, patience, and resilience. Fear no longer dominates. Instead, presence reigns. Incorporating awareness into daily life does not require retreating from the world. It can be as simple as noticing the breath while commuting, feeling the texture of your clothes, or listening fully during a conversation. Each act of presence strengthens the mind's capacity to see clearly, to respond skillfully, and to embrace life without fear. Moreover, mindfulness deepens the realization of no self. When we observe thoughts and feelings without identification, we witness the mind's dynamic flow. We see that I am not a fixed entity but a process, a moment-to-moment awareness. This realization naturally softens attachment, dissolves fear, and opens the heart to life as it is. As we deepen our mindfulness and awareness, a subtle transformation begins. The rigid boundaries of self soften. We begin to perceive that the fears, joys, and sorrows we experience are not isolated. They ripple outward, intertwined with the lives of others. This is the doorway to compassion, a heart that resonates beyond the confines of I and mine. Compassion is not mere sympathy or pity. It is a profound recognition of interconnectedness. When we see no self, we understand that the suffering of another is not separate from our own. Just as a river flows freely, touching countless shores, our awareness can extend, embracing the world with empathy and understanding. Consider this: fear often isolates. It erects walls around the heart, convincing us that we must protect ourselves at all costs. Yet when mindfulness illuminates the transient and interconnected nature of experience, these walls begin to crumble. The same awareness that reveals no self also reveals the shared vulnerability of all beings. In that revelation, the heart opens naturally to compassion. Daily life offers countless opportunities to cultivate this compassionate awareness. A kind word to a stranger, a patient ear to a friend, a thoughtful gesture toward someone in need. These small acts are powerful expressions of fear transcended. They are the natural outpouring of a mind that sees beyond self, a heart that recognizes the shared human journey. Compassion is also transformative for the self. Paradoxically, by reaching outward, we find freedom within. When fear drives us to cling or resist, we become trapped in isolation. But when we act with empathy and care, the mind relaxes, the heart expands, and the grip of fear diminishes. The cycle of suffering begins to dissolve, replaced by a gentle courage born of connection. The Buddha taught that true compassion is inseparable from wisdom. Awareness of no-self informs compassionate action, ensuring it is skillful and effective. Without understanding the impermanent and interdependent nature of reality, our efforts may be misguided or constrained by attachment. But when insight guides the heart, compassion becomes a fearless force, grounded in reality rather than sentimentality. Imagine a world where this awareness ripples outward, where each act of kindness, each moment of mindful presence, carries the understanding of no self and the courage to act wisely. Fear loses its dominion, not through denial or avoidance, but through the cultivation of a heart both awake and engaged. In this chapter of the journey, we see that the liberation from fear is not merely an internal experience. It extends naturally into the world, shaping our relationships, our communities, and our capacity to live fully. Mindfulness and awareness are the anchors. Compassion and connection are the wings that carry us beyond the self, beyond fear, into a life of profound engagement and fearless love. And as the heart opens, the mind prepares for the next step, embracing uncertainty and change with equanimity, trusting the flow of life rather than resisting it. Life in its inexorable flow carries both joy and sorrow. Just as waves rise and fall upon the shore, moments of loss and the reality of death touch each of us. Fear of death is perhaps the most primal fear, the shadow that lingers behind every choice, every attachment, every longing. Yet, the teachings of no-self offer a radical liberation, a lens through which death is not an enemy, but a natural transition, a transformation that reveals the profound interconnectedness of all life. When we cling to the illusion of self, the end of life feels like annihilation. The thought of separation, of loss, can paralyze us with anxiety. Yet understanding no-self illuminates a deeper truth. Nothing is ever truly lost, for there is no permanent entity to lose. Life flows, interconnected and ever-changing, and death is but a shift in the great tapestry of existence. Courage in the face of death arises not from denial but from clarity. Mindfulness, practiced daily, prepares us for these inevitable moments. It teaches us to witness impermanence without resistance, to embrace change without clinging, to meet the unknown with a calm, steady heart. When we see that our fears are born from attachment to a fixed self, the power of fear begins to dissolve. Grief, too, is transformed. Loss is not erased, nor should it be. Instead, it becomes a portal to deeper understanding. Compassion, so carefully nurtured in the previous chapter, deepens when we recognize that the sorrow of others is not separate from our own experience. We learn to hold life and death, joy and sorrow, in a single, compassionate embrace. Consider the wisdom of the Buddha, who urged his disciples to observe the impermanence of all things. By contemplating death, we awaken to the preciousness of each moment, each breath, each connection. Courage is cultivated not in grand gestures, but in the quiet acceptance of what is, allowing us to meet the inevitable with dignity and peace. In practical life, this courage manifests in small but profound ways. Sitting with a dying loved one, speaking words of love that may never be heard again, offering support to those navigating grief. These acts are fearless because they arise from awareness of no self, and the understanding that life and death are part of a continuum. Facing death is not morbid, it is liberating. It dissolves trivial fears, illuminates the depth of each relationship, and strengthens our capacity for love, empathy, and presence. We begin to live not in fear of the end, but in profound appreciation of the unfolding journey. Through this lens, we see that life's impermanence is not a threat, but a teacher. Every ending, every loss invites us to awaken, to deepen compassion, and to act with courage and clarity. And as we internalize this wisdom, our hearts prepare to face not only death, but every uncertainty, every challenge, every fear that once held us captive. In the whirlwind of modern life, anxiety has become a quiet epidemic. Emails pile up, deadlines loom, social media scrolls endlessly, and the mind races, chasing countless what-ifs. Fear of failure, fear of judgment, fear of the unknown. These anxieties gnaw at our peace, leaving many of us trapped in a cycle of stress. Yet the teachings of No Self offer a profound remedy, a way to navigate modern chaos with clarity and calm. Anxiety often arises from attachment, not only to outcomes, but to the very idea of a fixed self that must succeed, must be validated, must control the uncontrollable. The mind clings to a fragile identity, and when reality shifts, fear emerges. Recognizing No Self, we begin to see that this identity is an illusion, a temporary construct shaped by thoughts, feelings, and social pressures. Once this lens is applied, the grip of anxiety loosens. Mindfulness becomes our anchor. In the midst of a bustling city, a noisy office, or a crowded subway, we can cultivate presence by returning to the breath, observing sensations, and gently noting thoughts without judgment. Each mindful pause reminds us, we are not our anxieties, we are the awareness that witnesses them. Equally transformative is the practice of compassion, not only toward others, but toward ourselves. Anxiety often thrives in self-criticism, in the relentless comparison to an imagined ideal self. When we meet our own struggles with kindness, acknowledging imperfection as part of the human experience, anxiety loses its potency. We create a spaciousness within, where fear cannot dominate. In practical terms, this may look like stepping back from digital distractions, slowing the pace of our lives, and creating daily rituals that reconnect us to the present moment. Journaling, meditative walks, conscious breathing, or even a few minutes of quiet reflection can act as lifelines in a world designed to keep the mind racing. Modern life will continue to bring challenges, uncertainties, and moments of tension. But understanding the impermanent and fluid nature of self allows us to face these moments with resilience. We learn to ride the waves of stress without being swept away, to feel the discomfort without being consumed by it. Anxiety is not eliminated. It is transformed into awareness, clarity, and even wisdom. When we integrate these practices into daily life, the ordinary becomes extraordinary. We discover a freedom that is independent of circumstance, a steadiness in the eye of the storm. And just as we have faced the fear of death and loss with courage, we now face the pressures of modern existence with equanimity, grounding ourselves in the timeless teachings of No Self. Freedom is not a distant destination. It is not a reward for enduring life's hardships. It is lived, moment by moment, through the conscious practice of No Self. When we truly understand that the self is a fluid, impermanent construct, fear loses its hold. We discover a freedom that is not dependent on circumstances, a liberation that flows from within. In action, this understanding transforms every aspect of daily life. Decisions are made with clarity, not clinging. Conflicts are met with composure, not defensiveness. Success and failure, praise and criticism rise and fall. They no longer dictate our inner peace. We act from a place of wisdom rather than reaction. Mindfulness and awareness continue to serve as anchors, but now they are fully integrated. The breath, once a tool for quieting anxiety, becomes a guide in navigating choices, relationships, and challenges. We pause before reacting, observe before judging, and respond with intentionality rather than habit. This is the subtle power of No Self in action. Compassion deepens in this state. Without attachment to ego, we recognize the interconnectedness of all beings. Generosity flows naturally, empathy arises without effort, and our interactions become a reflection of understanding rather than expectation. Fear of rejection fades, replaced by a willingness to engage authentically with the world. In modern life, practicing No Self does not mean withdrawal or passivity. It means engagement without attachment, action without grasping. Whether at work, in family life, or in moments of creativity, we bring awareness, presence, and compassion to every task. Each act, no matter how small, becomes a meditation, a living embodiment of wisdom. The courage cultivated through facing mortality and the clarity gained from overcoming anxiety now converge. We live not in fear, not in craving, but in a balanced harmony with the flow of existence. Freedom is not a concept, it is a lived experience, grounded in observation, compassion, and the unshakable understanding that no self is the source of liberation. And as we carry this wisdom into every day, the ordinary becomes extraordinary. The mundane transforms into a canvas for practice, and life itself becomes a teacher. We act freely, live mindfully, and embrace the present with a serenity that is unshakable, rooted not in the illusions of self, but in the timeless truth of liberation. As our journey through the teachings of no self draws to a close, we arrive at a profound truth. Fear is never an inherent part of our being. It is a shadow cast by attachment, by clinging to the illusion of a permanent self. When the mind recognizes the fluidity of all things, when the heart embraces impermanence and interconnectedness, fear naturally dissolves. Living fearlessly does not mean that life becomes devoid of challenges. It does not erase pain or loss, but it changes how we relate to them. With the understanding of no self, we encounter difficulties with equanimity. We navigate uncertainty with clarity. We engage fully with life, unburdened by the need to control or defend an egoic identity. Every breath, every thought, every action becomes an opportunity to practice freedom. Compassion deepens, awareness sharpens, and courage arises, not from force but from insight. Fear loses its grip because we no longer identify with it. We are no longer a fixed self that can be threatened. Instead, we are the ever-changing flow of life itself, resilient, present, and free. And in this freedom, life opens its arms in quiet invitation. Moments that once felt heavy or frightening now shimmer with possibility. Relationships become spaces of genuine connection. Work, creativity, and even routine tasks are touched by presence and purpose. Fearlessness is not a distant horizon. It is the natural unfolding of understanding and practice. This is the essence of the journey beyond fear, a life lived fully, freely, and consciously. A life where the teachings of no self are not abstract ideas but lived experiences, guiding, liberating, and enriching every moment. And if this journey resonated with you, if these insights stirred a quiet recognition within, we invite you to continue walking this path with us. Subscribe to Zen Buddhism Wisdom, where each week we explore the timeless teachings of the Buddha, uncover practical wisdom for modern life, and discover how ancient insight can illuminate your daily journey. Turn on notifications so you never miss a step along this path of mindful living, compassion, and fearlessness. And remember, every moment is an opportunity to practice, to awaken, and to live freely.